Side 2, The Broken Bubble by Philip K. Dick, continuing on page 37. Haynes in the living room said, "I'm going to have to run along. Briskin, you have anything you want to say before we go? Any comments or suggestions?" Jim walked into the living room. "Mr. Haynes," he said, "what do you listen to when you turn on the radio?" Gravely, Haynes said, "I never listen to the radio if I can help it. I stopped listening years ago." Both Bob Posen and Haynes shook hands with him, told him when he could expect his check, and then went out of the apartment into the hall. "Want a ride home?" Posen said to him. "No," he said. "You look ready to get out." He began to close the hall door between himself and them. "Now, wait a minute," Posen said. A slow, uneasy flush crept up in his face as he realized that Jim was going to remain behind in the apartment with Patricia. "Good night," Jim said. He shut the door and locked it. The bell rang instantly, and he opened the door. "What?" "I think you better come along," Posen said. He was out in the hall alone. Haynes was already on his way to the stairs. "I'm too sick to come along," Jim said. "You're not sick. There's nothing wrong with you. You're just too big a slacker to do your job. You got the whole station into trouble, and you're just going to stand around slobbering in your drink. Go to hell," Jim said, closing the door. Posen's foot came out, wedging itself in the way. "Now look here," Posen said shakily. "We're grown men. You were married to Pat, but that's over and done with. You have no claim on her. What's your name on the phone book for?" Ted Haynes from the end of the hall said, "Are you coming or aren't you?" After a brief conflict, Posen withdrew his foot and Jim closed the door. He locked it and then walked back into the kitchen. Somewhere he had set down his drink. The glass was lost. In the cupboard he found another to take its place. Good Lord in heaven, he thought, the things that could happen to a rational man. While he was fixing himself another drink, Pat came out of the bedroom in a long, pale blue robe. "Oh," she said, startled to see him. "I'm still here," he said. "They left." "I thought you all were gone," she said. "I'm suspended for a month, without pay." An ice cube skidded from his hands and onto the floor. He bent to pick it up. "Starting when?" "Now. Today." "That's not so bad. That's not bad at all. He must want to keep you. That'll give you time to think it over." She was watching him warily. The towel was gone. In the bedroom she had combed her hair out, dried it, and fluffed it. Her hair spread out against the collar of her robe, long and soft and dark. "Nice," he said. Then suddenly he said, "I give up." She went and got a cigarette. "Go home and go to bed." Clouds of cigarette smoke billowed toward the light mounted over the sink, the plastic-hooded kitchen light. She tossed the match into the sink and folded her arms. "Or do you want to stay here?" "No," he said. "I'll leave." Taking his glass from him, she poured the rest of the drink away. "In a month, you'll know what it is you want to do." "I don't want to do anything," he said. "You will." Again she was watching him, calmly, in her confident manner. "You're lucky, Jim." "Because he didn't fire me?" Sighing, she left the kitchen. "I'm too tired to talk about it." She went into the bedroom, put her cigarette in the ashtray on the end table by the clock, and then stretched out on the bed in her robe, her head on the pillow, her knees drawn up. "What a day," she said. He came in and sat down by her. "How about getting remarried?" "What do you mean? You mean you and me again? Are you saying that seriously, or do you just want to see what sort of reaction you'll get?" He said, "Maybe I'll go up to the cabin." "What cabin?" "Yours, on the Russian River." "I sold it. Last year or the year before. I had to get rid of it. I wasn't using it." "But wasn't that a present from your father?" "In his will." Her eyes had closed. "That's too bad," he said, thinking about the cabin, the white boards of the porch, the tank of gas for the stove, half buried in leaves and dirt, the host of long-legged spiders that had rushed from the water closet the first time he had gone with her to open the cabin up. "Did you want to go away? Up in the country or something?" Maybe, he said. I'm sorry about the cabin. He had met her through the cabin. In the summer of 1951, 5 years ago, he had wanted to rent a cabin for his 2-week vacation. Going through the newspaper, he had come across the ad for Patricia's cabin and had gone to see her to find out how much she wanted. What do you rent it for, he said. $60 a month during the summer. Her family had lived in Bolinas, a fishing town set off by itself on the coast side of Marin County. Her father, before his death, was a rural real estate man, selling lots, farms, summer cabins in the resort areas. In 1951, she was working as a bookkeeper, 23 years old, isolated from her family. She had never respected her father. She described him as a windy, beer-drinking old man with varicose veins. Her mother, still living, was a mystic with a tea-reading shop near Stinson Beach. From that had come Patricia's contempt for phony idealism. She lived a brisk, efficient life, rooming with another girl in the marina, cooking her own meals, washing her own clothes. Her only concession to luxury was the buying of an opera ticket or a trip on the Greyhound bus. She loved to travel, and when he had met her, she had owned a set of oil paints and did an occasional still life or portrait. $60, he said. It seemed like too much for a cabin. She showed him a photograph of it tacked up beside the mirror of her dressing table. The cabin was on the river. The water was slow, and it spread out into the bushes and grass. In the photograph, Patricia rested with her hand against the railing of the cabin's porch. She wore a wool bathing suit, and she was smiling into the sun. That's you, he said. Yes, I used to go up there with my brother. Her brother, she told him, was killed during the Second World War. He asked about seeing the cabin. Do you have a car? She had been hanging clothes on the line in the backyard of the rooming house. It was Sunday, and she was home. I don't have a car. I haven't been up there since the 40s. Somebody up there, a real estate man, a friend of my father's, was keeping it fixed up for us. He drove her up the coast highway in his car. They left San Francisco at 11 in the morning. At 12:30, they pulled off the road to have lunch. They were near Bodega Bay in Sonoma County, and they ate a meal of prawns dipped in batter, beer, and tossed green salad. I like seafood, she said. We always had fish of some kind. Bolinas is a dairy town, and before my father was a real estate man, he was in the dairy business. We used to drive at night in the fog over Panoramic Highway to San Francisco. The fog was so thick he had to open the car door and look down at the white line, or we would have gone off the road. She seemed a happy and bright girl. He thought she was exceptionally pretty. She wore a sleeveless blouse and a long skirt almost to her ankles. Her black hair was tied in 2 braids, and in each braid was a ribbon. At 2 o'clock they reached the Russian River. By that time they had stopped for gas and had gone into a roadside tavern, a redwood and neon place where the jukebox was playing Frenesy. Kids, high school kids in white cotton shorts and shirts, filled up the booths, eating hamburgers and drinking Cokes. The racket was terrific. Both he and Pat had a couple of drinks. They felt good. When they reached Guerneville on the Russian River, they stopped again at another tavern, also redwood and neon, and had a couple more drinks. By the time they reached the cabin, the time was 3:30 in the afternoon, and they were both pretty well looped. The cabin was overgrown with weeds and brambles. One of the back windows was broken. The river had, at some recent time, risen and filled the front room with mud. The porch was broken and sagging. The railing, against which she had leaned in the photograph, was gone completely. When they pried the door open, the hinges and lock were rusted, they found that mice and ground squirrels had destroyed the sofa and mattresses and chairs. Somebody had broken in and stolen the pipes from the stove. The electricity was off, and the supply of gas was almost gone. Jesus, Patricia said, walking back outside to gaze across the river. I'm sorry. He said, in 2 or 3 days it can be fixed up. Can it? It looks dreadful. She tossed a stone into the water. On the far side, tiny children were paddling. People on the beach were sunning themselves. The afternoon air was hot, dry. Around them, the bushes rustled with the wind. It's nice up here, he said. He found a shovel and cleaned out the debris, the silt and rubbish. With the windows and doors open, the cabin aired out rapidly. Pat, using a heavy needle and thread, managed to repair the mattresses to some degree. "But you can't cook," she said. "How can you fix meals? The stove won't work without pipes." He had lost interest in that part. He had become interested in her. "They probably have pipes around here," he said, "and glass for the window." "If you say so," she said. When the sun began to set, they walked into Guerneville and had dinner at one of the restaurants. After dinner, they sat at the table drinking beer. By 9 o'clock, neither of them was in any condition to drive back to San Francisco. "This is a hell of a thing," he said when they left the restaurant. Kids roamed the streets. Kids in hot rods screeched by. The night air was pleasant. Off to their left was the river. He could see it glinting. The river did not seem to move at all. Somewhere the Sonoma County people had dammed it up. Beside him, Pat strolled contentedly. "I like it up here." She had changed into jeans and gone wading. Her jeans rolled up to her knees. Her legs were smooth, light. She walked barefoot. "Don't the stones hurt your feet?" he asked. "Everybody up here walks barefoot," she said. She stumbled a little, and he caught her. "Be careful," she said to him. "Why?" He held on to her arm. "I think I'm drunk." "I think you are, too," he said. "I think we both are." On the bed, her eyes shut, Pat said, "We stayed there that night, didn't we? Was the electricity on?" "No," he said. "It was still shorted." He'd got the lights working the next day. "Did you make love to me that night?" "You're darn right I did," he said. She reached out for her cigarette, stirring on the bed. "Why isn't it like that anymore?" "Your fault. My fault." "Nobody's fault," she murmured. He took the cigarette from her fingers. She was dropping it to the covers. "Thanks." He said, "Remember that beanery down in the Tenderloin?" "Where we stood?" she said. "Where they didn't have chairs or stools, just the counter? That was where all the longshoremen ate, down by the produce area and the docks." Her voice trailed off. All the various places, he thought. The second-hand record shop on Eddy Street, where the old man fussed with the albums, not knowing what he had in stock, but knowing everything there was to know about the records themselves. And the nights they had rushed upstairs floor by floor at the War Memorial Opera House, battling to get to the rail first, clutching their standing room tickets. And, he thought, the day they had bought the firecrackers and given them to the kids, the illegal firecrackers. They had driven down to San Jose to buy them. Early morning in the San Francisco streets, driving with the car full of fireworks, cones and pinwheels and cherry bombs, giving them away to the kids. And, he thought, then the police. "They sure got us," he said. "They?" "The police, for the firecrackers." "Yes," she said. He leaned down and kissed her. She did not protest. She turned a little toward him, drawing her knees up and burying her head down between her arms. Her hair spilled over her shoulders, and he smoothed it away from her face, out of her eyes. "Maybe I will stay," he said. "Can I?" Presently she said, "Okay." "I love you," he said. He put his arm under her and lifted her up against him. She was a dead weight, sound asleep without resistance. "You know that?" he said. "Yes," she murmured. "But I'm not good enough for you." "No." "Who is?" he said. She did not answer. Her hair brushed against his wrist, and he kissed her again on the mouth. Her lips gave, and he was conscious of her teeth, her hard teeth, relaxed, apart, and the motion of her breath in her throat. "No," she said. "We better not." She struggled up. "I'm sorry. I wish we could. We better just go to sleep. I think you should sleep above the sheet, so we can't without going to a lot of trouble. Don't you agree?" "If that's what you want." She opened her eyes. "It's not what I want. I wish we could. Maybe we could." "No, it wouldn't be right. Come on, get into bed and let's go to sleep. You don't have to get up early tomorrow, but I do. I have to get up at 6:30. Going here and there in her apartment, he shut off the heater and the lights and made certain that the door was locked. When he re-entered the bedroom, he found her standing sleepily by the bed, her robe in her arms. He took it from her and hung it in the closet. "How serious is this business with Posen?" he said. She shook her head without answering. Already she was in bed, tucking the covers over her. She wore some kind of single-piece material, but he did not see what it was. He did not recognize it. Something new. Something she had bought after she had left him. As he got into bed above the sheet, separated from her by the surface of material, she put her arms against him, her fingers pressing against his head. "This is nice," she said, but she was falling asleep. She was drifting away. The outline of her body was vague under the sheet, and he could not reach it. He could not grasp her. When he tried to take hold of her, he found himself holding nothing but material, the uniform cotton material, bleached and absolutely clean and absolutely impersonal. She turned away from him, and that was that. 5. No joy in Fogville. The other night, long and short-haired disc jock Jim Briskin on radio, recall you TV addict, station KOIF, got off a doozy of a reading of a Looney Luke, 3 Uggs and a Blah, commercial right twixt Beethoven and Brahms. Said Briskin, Looney Luke sells clean cars, which Looney Luke thought was fine. And then he said, that's enough of that commercial, which darn near everyone else in town thought was fine. So now no more Looney Luke commercials on KOIF, because even if you weren't listening, the sponsor was. But now poor Jim's on suspension, lost a month's pay. Alas, no justice in this here world. From within his concealed and reinforced loft, Ludwig Grimmelman watched the 3 of them approach. It was late in the afternoon, and the day was hot and fair. The sidewalk sparkled, outlining the figures. First walked Ferda Heinke, in his fairy suit, in his baggy pants and sweater. He wore his glasses and carried a binder full of school and library books, and, of course, a number of recent copies of his science fiction magazine, Phantasmagoria. After Ferda came Joe Mantilla, and then came Art and Rachael. Grimmelman's loft had once been a union meeting hall. It was a single large barren room with a stove at one end. A small bathroom led to the rear, where the stairs arose. This was in the Hayes Hole section of San Francisco, the slum district of liquor stores and old unpainted rooming houses. Beneath Grimmelman's loft was a series of crib rooms, now used as storerooms for Rodriguez's Mexican and American foods, the grocery store on the ground level. Across the street was a tiny Catholic church. As the 3 of them trudged along, Joe Mantilla said, "Let's go get a Coke." "No," Ferda said, "this is important." Art and Rachael agreed. "We have to tell him." They trailed single file along the path of lettuce leaves and torn orange crates by the side of the grocery store. Here and there a chicken stalked, pecking among the weeds. In a rear house, an elderly Mexican woman sat on a porch, rocking. A gang of Negro and Mexican children scampered after a beer can, kicking it and shouting shrilly as it bounced into the street. As the 3 of them reached the stairs, Ferda Heinke stopped. "Of course," he said, "he's probably already heard about it." "Get going," Art and Rachael said. But he felt tense, too. Above them in the loft, Grimmelman was certainly peering. Art could feel the pressure of Grimmelman's eyes, bright little eyes. Grimmelman, the hairy owl, in his black wool overcoat, wearing paratrooper's boots, his cheap cotton undershirt showing. "Okay," Ferda said, starting up the stairs. At the top was the metal door which Grimmelman had prepared against invaders. It began to open, and by the time they had reached it, there was Grimmelman gazing down, grinning and dancing, rubbing his hands together, retreating to admit the callers. In the light of day he had a ruffled look, a disorder about him. Expecting no one, he had removed his boots. He waited in his stocking feet. He, in his mid-20s, born in Poland across the border from Germany, had a round, Slavic face. His face was marred with a beard that covered his jowls and neck, a smear like singed pin feathers. His hair was thinning, and in a few years he would be bald. Art, following Ferda, caught the old cloth smell of Grimmelman, the familiar staleness of the man's seclusion. Grimmelman dwelt here, laboring on his maps, his revolutionary schemes, the phrasing of his vast theories. In summer, his money gone, he emerged to work day and night in the canneries, a marathon ordeal that brought in enough for the balance of the year. The long room was littered with books and papers. At the side was a sagging sofa, on which at night Grimmelman, in his overcoat, slept. Weapons were mounted on the walls, army pistols and grenades, a pair of swords, and, held by Scotch tape, prints of World War I battleships. Grimmelman's work table sagged with material. Nobody really knew what he was preparing. Its scope shaded into infinity. "Something's happened," Joe said, settling down on the sofa. Grimmelman glanced at him, grinned, turned inquiringly to Art. Art said, "It was in the Chronicle. You know Jim Briskin, this disc jock that runs Club 17 in the afternoons? He got fired." "He got suspended," Ferda said, "for a month." Grimmelman's eyes sparkled. "Oh?" He strode to the metal door and bolted it. "Tell me why." "He read this commercial wrong," Art said. "This used car commercial, you know." Excitedly, Grimmelman strode to the giant wall map of San Francisco. On the map, in his cramped hand, he had noted all the significant elements that made up the town. For an interval, he studied the map, inspecting the notations at Van Ness Avenue and the used car lots. "Exactly which used car lot was it?" "Looney Luke's," Art said, "where Nat used to work." Grimmelman stuck a pin into the map. "When did this happen?" "Night before last," Ferda said. Grimmelman's agitation increased. "Did any of you hear it?" "No," Art said. "It was later on during the classic music, not on Club 17. At the map, Grimmelman said, "This is an important event." He took a fountain pen and jotted a further entry in the notebook open beside the map. From a card file, he selected several references, and then he opened a heavy case. "A number of possibilities may now occur." "Like what?" Art said, experiencing, as always, the radiant energy of Grimmelman's intrigue. What a drab world it was without Grimmelman. His sensitivity to covert forces of mystical power and tenacity colored to a fever glow the most ordinary happenings. And this event, the vanishing of the familiar voice of Jim Briskin, already interesting, became in Grimmelman's hands a prize of much promise. Facing his map, Grimmelman was discovering overtones invisible to the unpracticed eye. "First," Grimmelman declared, "it may be that he was instructed to read it wrong. We must not dismiss that." "That's dumb," Joe Mantilla said. Grimmelman favored him with a glance. "It's not probable, but it is possible. In what way did he read the commercial wrong?" "He said he was sick and tired of it," Art said. "He said the hell with it. And he didn't finish. He broke off in the middle." "I see," Grimmelman said. "And," Ferda Heinke said, "that's the last he was on. He wasn't on yesterday or today. And then there was this mention in the Chronicle." Unzipping his binder, he showed Grimmelman the item. "May I keep this?" Grimmelman said. He added the item to a scrapbook, gluing it in and rubbing it flat with his fist. "It's sure too bad," Art said. "Now there's some joker running Club 17, and he's no good at all. He only plays the records. He don't say nothing at all." "You think this is the time?" Joe Mantilla said abruptly. Grimmelman said, "It could be." "The time," Art repeated. In the environment built up around Grimmelman, nothing superseded the idea of the time. Art felt the wave of anticipation. A host of emotions swam up inside him. The others, too, were affected. The organization, as a group, lived for the time. Their sorties were arranged in an almost occult pattern of correct moments, conjunctions of astrological bodies. A peasant cunning mixed with peasant superstition welded Grimmelman to the stars. His plans were cosmic and cosmically determined. Always, in everything, Grimmelman consulted for signs to demonstrate that at long last the moment had arrived, the instant in which successful action was finally and absolutely possible. Time for the organization to act, Ferda said, hypnotized by the idea. All of them envisioned at once the ritual of action, the bringing out of the massive car from its hiding place, the thorough working over of the engine and electronic controls so that no hitch could occur, and the checking of the weapons. But Grimmelman was hesitating. The Horch hasn't been out in months. He studied his charts. 3 months. Sure, Joe said. It's time. 3 months, that's a long time. Let's get going, Art said, sharing his restlessness. Grimmelman said, hasty action is wasted. You and your charts, Joe Mantilla said disgustedly. Saturday night, Art said. The Bactrians are having a dance at Bratton's place. The Bactrians were a club of well-to-do youths from Nob Hill. Bill Bratton was their president. His father was a wealthy Montgomery Street attorney. Afterwards, some of them will probably stop at Dodo's. There's 40 of them, Ferda said, and only 11 of us. If very many of them show up, we're cooked. We'll do it like we did last time, Joe said. Park on the edge, get one of their cars going out. Same deal. In any case, Grimmelman said, deep in thought, we could go ahead and activate the Horch. In Art's ears, the words fell beautifully. Activation of the organization's remote-controlled car, with its speakers and antennae, and fantastic straight-eight engine. The Horch, its lights off, speeding down Highway 99, escaping silently from encounter with the enemy as they drove behind, directing it. And, in a ditch, the flipped-over carcass of a '56 Ford. On the wall of the loft were trophies, remnants taken from the vanquished. The Horch had gotten away each time. Grimmelman was cautious. Each incident was scrupulously planned out. At his work tables, Grimmelman pointed to a relay board with its wiring and tubes and booster circuits. A soldering iron was beside it. He was in the process of working on this part of the Horch's system. I have to get it finished, or the Horch will be silent. The Horch could not be silent. The taunting voices, magnified and distorted, were vital. Otherwise the Horch, as it sped off, could not announce itself. It could not boom out who and what it was. Ferda Heinke said suddenly, Hey, you know, Rachel's going to have a baby. He glanced apologetically at Art. His wife, Rachel. At his work table, Grimmelman shivered. He did not look at them. He concentrated on his notebooks. The oily girl, he thought. The outsider. He felt fear. As she walked, the slow, heavy walk of a woman, she gave forth a spearmint smell, spearmint and soap. And the eyes fixed on him, the judgment. She had seen him, judged him, dismissed all of them and their various plans. The room had become silent. They all felt subdued. The woman walked among them, taking away their excitement. On the sofa, Ferda Heinke fussed with his schoolbooks and magazines. Joe Mantilla stared at the floor. Art Emanuel wandered to the door of the loft, his hands in his pockets. The air was oppressive. Beyond the locked metal door, the sounds of the Negro and Mexican children filtered to him faintly, a tinny sound, like the rustling of weeds. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Van Ness Avenue lay under blown bits of paper. Wind had left a scatter in each shop's doorway. The waning sunlight made the scatter seem white. The cars at Nat's auto sales were older, pre-war. On the side of the bakery by the lot, a sign was painted. Cars that work for people that work. At the fourth car, a 1939 Dodge, Nat Emanuel was opening the hood and connecting the battery charger. Here was his lot. Here was he, in cloth jacket and tan slacks, discovering that the battery cable of this car was eroded and would have to be replaced. At the end of the day, he inspected his cars and learned the worst about each of them. The tires that had sagged, the batteries with dead cells, the rear main bearings that leaked oil. He walked across Van Ness Avenue, stopping for the cars and then running, until he was on the far side and entering Herman's garage, specialists in carburetors rebuilt. The entrance was blocked by cars waiting to be fixed. In the back, by the workbench, Herman had crawled within a Packard to adjust the brake. Nat reached into the litter of parts on the bench, pushing and rooting among the valves. gaskets, discarded fan belts. "You got such a thing as a battery cable for a pre-war Dodge?" he said. "Let me tell you a story," Herman said. He emerged, wiping grease from his face and hands. "You believe in God?" "No," Nat said, examining a clutch plate, wondering if he could make use of it in one of his cars. "You believe it's wrong to spray over rust?" "Naturally. So the paint falls off next week. That's the used car business." Herman nodded his head toward the Packard. "You know whose that is?" "Luke's." "Luke sprays over rust. Luke fills up the dents with putty." "I used to work for him," Nat said. "How about the cable?" "You like him?" "I don't care," he said. He had been in the used car business too long to care about paint over rust. He had done a little of that himself. Bending, he picked up a set of discarded plugs. "Can I have these?" "For nothing?" "Or what do I get back?" "How about 50 cents? Something like that. Whatever you want. It's up to you." While Nat was regapping the plugs, Luke Sharpstein walked into the garage to see about the Packard. He wore his usual straw hat, maroon shirt, and flannel slacks. "Fella," he said genially to Nat. "How's it go?" "Fine," Nat said noncommittally. Picking at his pale teeth with his toothpick, Luke said, "Moving anything?" "Not a drop." Luke said, "Can you use a couple of Lincolns? 49s. Good and clean? Give them to you cheap. Too old for me. Maybe swap a couple of Chevys even." "All I have is junk," Nat said. "You know that. I'm in the yo-yo business." And it was Luke with his powerful sales techniques that had put him there, had put all the small dealers there. Luke smiled his false teeth smile. "I can use a few 41 Chevys for my jalopy lot. If you have any Willis Overlands, I might take them," Nat said with heavy irony. Without a trace of humor, Luke said, "Well, I have a Willis station wagon, a 51, dark green." "No good." Herman at the valve grinding machine said to Luke, "I got your Packard. The brakes are up." Taking his regapped plugs, Nat Emanuel left the garage and recrossed Van Ness Avenue to his lot. A colored man was kicking the tires of a 40 Ford coupe, and Nat nodded to him. In the office, the cramped basalt block structure which he had built himself, his kid brother Art was peering at the naked girl calendar on the wall. "Hi," Art said as Nat carried in the box of plugs. "When did you get this?" "A month or so ago." Art said, "How about lending me a car for a couple of days? We sort of want to take a drive, maybe down to Santa Cruz." "You shouldn't be looking at that calendar." He put his hand over it, half seriously. "You're a married man." "Yeah," Art said. "Hey, how about that Dodge?" "The battery cable has to be replaced." Art followed him out of the office, onto the lot, his hands in the back pockets of his jeans. "Just for a couple of days. A weekend, maybe. So she can sit around on the beach." "How's Rachel?" "Okay." "Why she need to sit around on the beach?" Art said, "She's going to have a baby." He did not look directly at his brother. He fooled with the antenna on one of the cars. "What?" Nat said loudly. "When?" "January, I guess." "How the hell can you pay for a baby?" "We'll be okay." He scuffed at the ground. "You're 18 years old," Nat said, his voice rising. When he was angry, he had a mean, loud voice. Art knew it from childhood. "You don't know your ass from a hole in the ground. You think you're going to manage on $50 a month? Or, for Christ's sake, do you think she can keep on working?" The two of them were mute, and both breathed with difficulty. Gloom hung over them. Defeat was in the air, a cloud of it from all directions. Not thought about his used car lot, his row of old wrecks. He was making no money. He was on the verge of going out of business. How could he support a kid brother with a wife and baby? Resentment drained his strength. He had never approved of Rachel or the marriage. She had maneuvered the kid into it. This proved it. "That's what you deserve," he said. Art said, "Jesus, we're glad." "Glad?" He was incredulous. "Toss it in the bay." Art repeated. "We're glad." He could not understand his brother's attitude. The viciousness, the cruelty repelled him. "You're nuts," he said. "What kind of guy talks like that? You've been selling used cars too long." "You have a strange idea what being a nut is," Nat said savagely. "How about your pal Grimmelman and his bombs and maps? I'd call a guy nuts who's going to blow up the city hall and the police department." Art said, "They're not going to blow up anything. Natural conditions will take care of it." "Grow up," Nat said, irritated and discouraged. He washed his hands of them, his younger brother and Rachel. The hell with them, he thought. He had his own problems. "You can't expect the world to look after you," he said. "It's sink or swim. If you want to keep your head above water, you got to keep fighting." His outrage swelled. "How do you think this country was founded? By guys sitting around all day, doing nothing?" "You talk like I committed some crime," Art muttered. "Listen here," Nat said. "A couple years ago, I was working for that snow artist, Luke. Now I got a lot of my own. That's what you can do in a country like this. You can be your own boss and not take nothing from nobody. If you work hard, you can get your own business. You understand?" Art said, "I don't want a business." "Then what do you want?" After a long time, Art said, "I just want to stay out of the army." Nat stared at him, dumb with rage. "You slacker. You know if it wasn't for guys like me going overseas and taking care of the Japs, you'd be working for Tojo right now and learning Japanese in school instead of sitting in the can smoking cigarettes." "Okay," Art said. He felt ashamed and apologetic. "Take it easy. I'm sorry." "A stretch in the Army'd be the best thing in the world for you," Nat said. "That's what you should have done as soon as you got out of school. They ought to make them all go in as soon as they finish school. Instead," he thought to himself, "of letting them get married." Turning to the Dodge, he began removing the defective battery cable. In the kitchen of the basement apartment in the wooden house on Fillmore, Rachel peeled potatoes at the sink and listened to the radio. She was tired. During the morning, from 8 until noon, she had worked at the airline office. The company was a non-entity, 4 planes in all, but the ex-GIs who ran it were nice. They kidded her, and they bought her coffee. And now that she was pregnant, they had stopped making passes at her. Reaching, she took her cigarette from the ashtray on the table. The radio was playing a Stan Getz record. This was the program she listened to each afternoon. This was Club 17. But Jim Briskin was not on it. Somebody else was on, and she did not like him. He was not what she wanted to hear. Outside on Fillmore Street, a group of men walked by, noisy and abusive. A car honked. Traffic signals clanged. She felt a hollowness inside her. Where was the easy voice, the presence that had comforted because it had not asked for anything? She'd grown up in a hostile, quarreling family. Everybody had demanded something. Everybody had slashed at her. Jim Briskin had wanted nothing from her. What now, she wondered? What was there to take his place? When the front door opened, she said, "Dinner's ready." Art closed the door after himself and furred a hanky. "Hi," he said, sniffing the warm smell of food. Putting the silverware on the table, Rachel said, "Did you tell him?" "Yeah," he said. She went over to him and kissed him. Her arms around his neck were thin and cold and slightly moist from the dishes. Then she returned to the table. She moved slowly, setting out the plates and cups with care. The set of dishes was a present from Art's great-aunt, one of the few wedding presents they had received. Ferda, embarrassed, said to her, "Hey, congratulations about the baby." "Thank you," she said. Noticing that she was subdued, Art said, "Anything wrong?" "I turned on Club 17, she said. "Jim Briskin isn't on it. Somebody else is taking his place." "It was in the paper," Art said. "He's off for a month because he wouldn't read a commercial. They suspended him." She turned her swift, hard gaze on him. "Can I see it?" "Grimmelman has it," Art said. After a pause, Rachel said to Ferda Heinke, "Did you want to stay for dinner?" "I have to get home." He edged toward the door. "My mother's expecting me to get home by 6:30. At the icebox, Art poured himself a glass of beer from the quart bottle. "Stick around," he said. "We can go over the dummies for the magazine." "Why don't you?" Rachel said. During their 4 months of marriage, they had not had much company. 6. In the early afternoon, the telephone rang. Jim Briskin answered it, and a soft little feminine voice said, "Mr. Briskin?" "Yes," he said, not recognizing the voice. He seated himself on the arm of the couch, avoiding the records. They were a stack belonging to KOIF, which he planned eventually to return. "Who is this?" "Don't you know?" "No," he said. "Maybe you don't remember me. I met you down at the station the other day. I'm Art Emanuel's wife." "Sure, I remember you," he said, glad to hear from her. "I just didn't recognize you over the phone." "Do you have a second?" He said, "That's one thing I have plenty of. How have you been, Rachel?" "Pretty good," she said. "It sure is awful you're not being on Club 17. Art got the newspaper where it told about you. He didn't bring it home, but he told me what it said. Are you ever coming back?" "Maybe," he said. "I haven't decided. We'll see at the end of the month." "That guy, whatever his name is, he's no good." "What have you been doing?" he asked. "Nothing much." She paused. "I wondered, we both wondered, if you would like to come over for dinner." "I'd like to," he said, pleased. "Would you like to come tonight?" On the phone, she had a correct, painstaking manner. Her invitation was presented with formality. "Fine," he said. "About what time?" "Say 7 o'clock. You won't be disappointed if it isn't much." "I'm positive it'll be excellent." "But if it isn't?" she said, still serious. "Then it'll be nice seeing both of you again." She gave him the address, and he repeated it back. Then she said goodbye, and he hung up the phone. Cheered, he shaved and took a shower and put on a clean pair of slacks. The time was 2 o'clock. He had 5 hours to fill until dinner with the Emanuels, the balance of the afternoon and the beginning of the evening. Gradually, his good spirits left. Time, he thought. It was going to destroy him. Getting into his car, he drove out toward the Presidio. But his depression remained. He'd got to thinking about Pat. That was fatal. That was the one thing he could not let himself do. For half an hour he drove at random, and then he turned in the direction of Fillmore Street. The bars and shops were busy, and the sight of them restored some sense of optimism in him. He parked his car, locked the doors, and walked along the sidewalk looking at the numbers. The house itself, huge and in disrepair, was set back on its lot between a billboard and a hardware shop. A wire fence ran along the edge of the sidewalk, and in the center was a rusty, ponderous gate. He managed to force the gate open. It groaned as he shut it after him. The cement walk led him to the side of the house. Steps descended to a wooden door, a separate basement apartment. He rapped at the door and waited. There was no response. For an interval, he rapped, waited, rapped again. They were not at home. His own fault, of course. This was a wild idea, a long shot. He started back up the steps, keenly disappointed. What now, he wondered. On the broad main steps of the building, the steps leading to the front porch, 3 teenage boys sprawled. They had watched him without comment as he rapped on the Emanuel's basement door. Now he noticed them for the first time. All 3 wore jeans and heavy boots and black leather jackets. Their faces were expressionless. "Are they out?" he asked. Finally, one of the boys inclined his head. "Do you know where they went?" No response. The faces remained blank. "You know when they'll be back?" Still no response. He started down the cement path to the sidewalk. As he was closing the gate after him, one of the boys said, "Try Dodo's." "What's that?" he said. After a pause, another of the boys said, "Dodo's Drive-In." "Down Fillmore," the first boy said. The third said nothing. He had a beaked, hostile face, and on his right cheek by his mouth was a crescent-shaped scar. "Couple blocks," the first boy said. "Thanks," he said. They continued to gaze after him as he walked off. Parked in the lot of the drive-in, its front facing the glass doors of the building, was a pre-war Plymouth. Inside were 4 or 5 kids, and one of them was a girl. He walked up cautiously beside the car. They were eating hamburgers and drinking malts from white cartons. The girl was Rachel. At first, neither she nor Art recognized him. "Hi," he said. "Oh," she said. "Hello." That was all she said. All 5 kids seemed subdued. They concentrated on their food. "Is this where you hang out?" he said clumsily. They nodded, dividing the nod among them. There was just the one nod for all 5 of them. Art said, "She's not feeling too good." "Anything serious?" he said. No." Another boy said, "She's feeling blue." "Yeah," Art said. "She's been feeling blue all day. She didn't go to work." "That's too bad," he said, concerned and knowing no way to show it. All 5 of them seemed blue. They munched and passed the malts back and forth. Once, Art bent to brush bits of fried potato from his pants. Another car, similar to theirs, drove up on the far side of the drive-in building. Kids stepped from it and walked indoors to order food. "Would anything cheer her up?" Jim asked. They held a conference. One of the boys said, "Maybe you could drive her to this lady's." "Her teacher," Art said. "She had in high school?" "Sure," he said, wanting to help. The door of the Plymouth presently opened. Rachel stepped out, walked to the trash dispenser with an empty carton, and then returned. Her cheeks were hollow and darkened, and she moved slowly. "Come on," she said to her husband. "Okay," Art said, "but I'm not going in. I don't want to see her." To Jim, Rachel said, "Where's your car?" "Down the street," he said. "I can go get it." "No." She shook her head. "I'd like to walk. I feel like walking." "What teacher is this?" he asked, as the 3 of them trudged along Fillmore, past the shops and bars. "My home economics teacher," Rachel said. "Sometimes I talk to her about different things." She kicked a bottle cap along the pavement until it rolled into the gutter. "I'm sorry I'm like this," she said, her head down. Art patted her. "It's not your fault." To Jimmy explained, "It's my fault. She's afraid because I'm mixed up with these guys and she don't like them. But I'm through with them. I really am." "I don't mind your being with them," Rachel said. "I'm just worried that—" She broke off. "She thinks they're going to do something," Art said. "Hey," he said to his wife, tugging her until she bumped against him. "No more for me, you hear? Last time was the last." Ahead of them was Jim's car. He unlocked the door and held it open for them. Wonderingly, Rachel said, "It must cost a lot to have a car like this." "Not worth it," he said. They were starting into the back, and he said, "We can all fit in front." When they were in, he closed the doors and backed out into traffic. As he drove, Rachel and Art put their heads together in an almost wordless discussion. Art said, "Hey, now she don't want to go there." To his wife he said, "Then where do you want to go?" Rachel said, "Remember when we used to go swimming all the time?" You can't go swimming." "I know," she said, "but remember we used to go out to the pool at Fleischacker Zoo? Maybe we could go out there and just sit. It ought to be nice out there." Making a left turn, he drove in the direction of Fleischacker Zoo. "This is sure nice of you," Art said. I'm glad to, he said, and he meant it. Did you ever go out there? Rachel asked. Whenever I could. I used to walk around the park. That's over farther, Rachel said. It's nice there, too. Now she seemed less despondent. She sat up straighter and began to look through the window at the cars and houses. The bright July sunlight shone from the pavement. Everything okay with the baby? Jim said. Yes, Rachel said. He said, I guess you don't have to worry about the army. Oh, they could take him, Rachel said. Art, I mean. In fact, they sent him a notice and he went down. And they classified him 1A, but he has a kidney condition. He can't eat a lot of foods, a lot of sweet stuff. And he didn't tell them. He forgot. So they were going to draft him, and he even had the notice that tells when to report. So I called them up, and I had to go down and talk to them. And then they didn't want him. So, they could take him, but I don't think they will. You don't want to go, Jim said. It was obvious enough. Art said, if they want me, sure, I'll go. But there's no war or nothing. Rachel said, they get everybody sooner or later. I think they want to have something so they can get you when they want you. Like in an emergency or something. They have everybody in a classification. Not women, Art said. The sun was warm on the trees and gravel paths, and on the water of the pool. On the rim of the pool, teenagers sunned themselves in trunks and bathing suits. 1 or 2 beach umbrellas had been erected. Rachel seated herself on the low steps overlooking the pool. In the company of the 2 kids, Jim began to feel old and overly tall. And yet, he thought, their situation was not so different from his. They were not so far apart in their problems. Let's walk, Rachel said. It's so dull here. The 3 of them walked from the pool in the direction of the zoo itself. At a wire cage, Rachel halted, and when he and Art looked back, they saw her in contemplation. What is it? Jim asked, returning. She said, I made the puma growl. The puma rested on an artificial tree branch in his cage. His muzzle was massive, more like a dog's than a cat's. His whiskers were short, stiff bristles. He did not deign to notice anyone. He needs a shave, Jim said. Rachel said, growl at him, and he growls back. They went on, plodding listlessly. Suddenly Rachel said, What's there to do? He was at a loss to answer. Lots of things. No, she shook her head. There isn't anything to do. I don't mean just now, either. Pretty soon you'll have plenty to do, when the baby comes. But even to him that did not seem enough. He wanted to give a better answer than that. For a man, he said, a job is the most important thing, and I don't see anything wrong with that. It's something to focus yourself on. You get better at it, whatever it is. You learn more. You become more skilled, and you can expand that. It can be more than just a job. Rachel said, I thought that was important, what you did. Not reading that commercial. It wasn't, he said. I was just tired, fed up, troubles with Pat. That was the day we saw you, Rachel said. Did it have anything to do with us? Yes, he said. Did we upset you? Yes, he said. You made me feel strange. Then your job wasn't the most important thing to you. You were willing to give it up for something else. He said, Why did you give me that role? Because I liked you. I wanted to give you something so you'd know. You did a lot for us with the program. We always listened. You were somebody we could trust. When you said something, it was true. Was that why you wouldn't read the commercial? Was there something in it that wasn't true? Sometimes they're so one-sided. They just say what's good about the product. Did you feel if you read it, people would think you believed it? And you knew you didn't believe it? You knew it wasn't true? When I heard what you had done, I thought that was probably the reason. Because if you didn't believe it, I knew you wouldn't read it. You never told us anything that wasn't true. If you had, if you lied to us, we wouldn't have listened. You shouldn't expect that much from some guy sitting at a microphone, Jim said. Some disc jock with a bunch of pop tunes to play and 3 hours to kill. All right, she said. Who should we listen to then? They used to tell us stuff in assembly. We read the same stuff in magazines, and they say it in churches. There's always a bunch of old ladies, like the PTA. They're always telling us what to do. But I figured that out a long time ago. It's what they want. It's what would be nicest for them. Wouldn't it be nice if we just curled up and died? If we never asked for anything, wanted anything, never bothered them? They have all this stuff that explains why they're right. But you know, they're always talking about dropping hydrogen bombs on the enemy. I hope when the war comes, the bombs get dropped on them, too. You mean us, he said. No, she said. Them. What do you mean, us? What do we have for them to bomb? You're liars, he said. I don't care. What difference does it make? What do we have to look forward to? She plodded along past the animals in their cages. I read in a book about frontier women. They churned butter, and they made their own clothes. Would you like that? Ponderously, she said, Who does that anymore? She had a point. You know, she said, I know a girl, a Jewish girl, and she went to Israel, and she worked on a farm, and she was out there in the desert. She carried a gun while she worked. And they all ate together, and everything they owned belonged to all of them, and they didn't get any money. They were part of this... She hesitated. I don't know the name. It's a Jewish word, sort of a community settlement. And before that, she used to live like us, sitting around doing nothing, wasting her time with nothing to do. Like we all used to walk down to the show together on Saturday night, me and her and a bunch of girlfriends, and just sit there in the show. And usually it was a love picture, you know, where they finally get together in the end, the good guy and the good girl, and you see him kissing her, and everything's wonderful. And they have this place up sort of in the country, with a lot of furniture and one of those big windows. Picture window, he said. And 2 new cars, and the furniture is sort of blonde and modern. Well, he said, there are houses like that. Art, ahead of them, pointed and said, Hey, look over that way. Speeding along the street beyond the zoo was a red and white convertible. In it were 4 boys, well dressed. The car was new and shiny, and the boys wore sweaters, and their hair was neatly combed. With a scream of tires, the convertible turned a corner and disappeared. Bactrians, Art said. Never mind, Rachel said. They were, though, she said to Jim. Did you know I was engaged to Bill Bratton? When I was in high school, we went steady for a couple of months. He's president of the Bactrians, Art explained. Their families have a lot of dough. His father's an attorney, and they have real new cars, and they have these dances. Rachel said, Bill used to take me dancing up to these expensive supper clubs. Sometimes we'd drive over into Marin County and up along the highway. We'd have dinner, and then we'd dance. I even wore his club pin. How'd you meet him? Jim asked. At a school dance. They all used to come into the gym in a group with their shoes shined and their hair combed. They looked pretty good. They danced good, Art said. They took instructions. Bill liked to rumba, Rachel said, and mambo, and I guess now they're real good at the cha-cha-cha. And I like to dance, so I used to go around with him. Art never could dance very good. I even had dinner one time up at the Brattons' home up on Nob Hill. They have a sort of mansion with a gardener to take care of the lawns, and a library and a lot of rooms, and this huge table. There must have been 20 people sitting at it. And then later on, Bill got into a lot of trouble up in San Rafael. Yeah, Art said. They made a mistake because the police up there don't know who Bratton is, and they put a whole lot of Bactrians in jail one night. They were driving through San Rafael, Rachel said. They cut up the tires of cars and pushed some cars down a hill, and they beat up some people going home. It was real late, and the car they were in was stolen. But the police caught them on Highway 1 near Olima. And they had beer in the car, and usually their families could get them off, but not this time. And some of them paid a lot of fines, and one kid, I guess he was over 21, went to jail for a year. Bill got a suspended sentence. I wasn't going around with him then. I stopped going around with him because of this initiation thing. They were down at Carmel, and I went along with Bill. I stayed at night with these girls, but during the day we went around and had a lot of fun. And then they wanted to make these guys they were initiating do these things. It was disgusting, and I left, and that was the last time I went out with him. It was really awful. I mean, it wasn't like people. I can't say what some of the things were, but finally one kid was killed, and then there wasn't so much of that. Boy, Art said, their family sure pulled a lot of strings to get them off. Are there many clubs like that, Jim said, among the upper-class kids? Rachel said, most of the kids from good homes belong to one club or another. They have pins and dances and initiations. And the trouble is, the reason the clubs are so strong is that their fathers used to belong to them. And the dances are held in those big houses up on Nob Hill. The parents sort of sponsor them. They have a lot of money. Like the Bactrian pin costs around $50. Ahead of them were the bear cages. They found a place to buy hot coffee and a place to sit. Rachel seemed tired from the walking. Her shoulders drooped. Across from her bench, children gathered to view the bears. One bear lay back on its rump, clutching its hind feet with its forepaws and rocking grotesquely from side to side. The sight seemed to make Rachel uncomfortable. What's the matter? Art asked, bending over her. Nothing. It just bothers me. Art said, maybe we ought to get back, so she can start fixing dinner. As they drove back toward the apartment on Fillmore, Rachel said, Who is Pat? My ex-wife, he said. She works down at KOIF. Is that the woman with the black hair? Art said. I think I saw her. She's real cute, real cool looking. It must be funny, Rachel said, not being married to somebody and still seeing them. It can be tough, he said. Does she like to work? She likes her job. Rachel said, I think if a man loves a woman, he should never leave her or go around with anybody else. Sometimes, Jim said, the woman doesn't want to have any more to do with him. Rachel nodded. Had you thought of that? He asked her. No, she said. I was very much in love with Pat, he said. In some respects, I still am. But she wanted something that I couldn't give her. How do you feel when you see her? Rachel asked. Do you still want to help her and do things for her and take care of her? Yes, he said. But I'm realistic enough to accept the fact that I can't. One of these days she's going to get married to the station business manager, a fellow named Bob Posen. He made a left turn onto Fillmore. Presently they were parked down the block from the house, and he was opening the car door for Rachel and Art. Don't be too disappointed, Rachel said, if I don't cook as well as Pat. He was amused. Okay, little Mrs. Wife. The apartment was below street level, and the living room was cool and damp. Pipes ran along the walls. How few pieces of furniture, he thought. A heavy round oak table was the largest piece, and then 2 chairs and the couch, and a dresser on which was a television set, an obsolete 12-inch Emerson with a rabbit ears antenna. Standing up in the corner were printer's dummies, titled Phantasmagoria in huge Gothic type. Rachael went at once to the kitchen and began preparing the meal. Throwing himself down on the couch, Art lit a cigarette and began to smoke nervously. The man of the house, Jim thought, feeling the gravity of his position. Not bad, Jim said, meaning the apartment. We've been living here since we got married. Art puffed more and more rapidly. Clouds of cigarette smoke obscured him. With a sigh, he drew in his feet and shifted about on the sofa. Rachael appeared at the kitchen doorway, looking for dishes. She, too, was anxious, and he thought to himself that this was an occasion for both of them. Probably she had little opportunity to cook for company, to play out her role as hostess. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "Don't make any," he said. "It's made. I just have to heat it up." "Okay," he said. "Thanks." When she returned to the kitchen, he said to Art, "How much do you pay for this?" $55 a month, Art said. He asked how much the two of them earned. "Counting what I get," Art said, "we make around $150 a month." Jim thought, and over a third of it goes for rent. "They really have you," he said, "on the rent." "Yeah," Art said fatalistically, "but this isn't bad for these days. Some places we saw, they wanted 60 and 70, and they weren't as good as this." "How are you going to get along when the baby comes? Have you made any plans?" Art shuffled his feet. "We'll be okay." "What are you going to buy food with? She can't keep on working." In the kitchen, Rachael shut off the water and came to the doorway. Her eyes, dilated and dark, fixed on him. "That's what his brother says." He was cowed. "But what's the answer? You earn 2/3 of your combined income. That'll cease when you quit your job." "Do you have any money?" Rachael said. "Some." "Well," she said, "why don't you give it to us?" Then she smiled. "You're all white. I scared you." "Yes," he said, "but not the money." "I know. You'd give it to us, wouldn't you?" "I would," he said, "but you wouldn't take it." She returned to the kitchen. "We hardly even know you." "You do," he said. "Not real well. Not that well." Art said, "We got lots of money. We got over $100 saved up." "Let me match it," he said suddenly. "Oh, no. Hell." Art laughed anxiously. "Come on," he said, wanting to. "Hell no," Art said. But he needed to. "What can I do?" he said. "For what?" Rachael said, appearing with a pot of coffee. "I'd like to do something to help." Neither of them answered. They were both a little surly. Like cats, he thought. Like the puma at the zoo. He had pestered them too much. "You haven't got the slightest ability to deal with your problems," he said. "You're living here in this slum without money. You're not living like adults. You're living like God knows what." "Because we don't have any money?" Rachael said. He said, "I'm afraid something will happen to you. And there's nothing I can do. I can't help you." Powerless, he thought. He was powerless to affect their lives, to alter things in any manner. His program was gone, his contact with them. He did nothing, no work, no act that had any meaning. How futile it made him feel. How superfluous. "Can't I buy you something?" he said. "Just drink your coffee," she said, placing the cup before him. "Do you understand how I feel?" he demanded, ignoring the coffee. Standing before him with the coffee pot, she said, "You can buy something for the baby. Some clothes. When the time comes. I'll write out what size and color." Returning to the kitchen, she seated herself at the table. With the recipe books open, she prepared dinner. 7. On Saturday night, a visitor rapped at Ludwig Grimmelman's locked metal door. "Who is it?" Grimmelman said. not recognizing the knock. From a wall rack, he took down an Army M1 rifle, sweeping up the secret documents and reports he had been preparing. He stuffed them into a briefcase, closed the snap, and pushed them into a hiding place. He turned off the light and stood in darkness, hearing his own breathing. "What do you want?" "Mr. Grimmelman," the voice said, a man's voice. Grimmelman went to a side window, unfastened the catch, raised it, and peered out. A man was standing in the outside stairwell, a heavy-set man in a topcoat, wearing a hat and a pressed suit. He was middle-aged. He seemed to be a salesman, probably an insurance salesman. Putting his light back on, Grimmelman unlocked and opened the door. "I'm busy. I refuse to buy anything." The man said, "I'm Ralph Brown, from the FBI." He flapped open a black leather identification folder. "I'd like to step in a moment and discuss a matter with you, if I may." "What's this about?" He backed away as Mr. Brown entered. "About a fellow you might know." Brown glanced about the room. "Quite a place you've got here." He strolled leisurely. "What fellow?" "Ever heard of an individual by the name of Kendallman? Leon Kendallman? We thought you might know him. Here's his picture." Mr. Brown, from the deep pocket of his topcoat, brought forth a packet. He opened the packet and handed Grimmelman a snapshot, blurred, indistinct. But nonetheless, the snapshot was familiar. "Why?" Grimmelman demanded. "Draft evasion." Grimmelman returned the snapshot. "No, I never saw him. And anyhow, your organization is infiltrated by communists. It's no use talking to you. It goes straight to MVD hatchet men in the labor school and around the PW. "You never saw this individual?" "No." "Positive?" "No, I never saw him." He was terrified because the snapshot, taken from a distance with a telescopic lens, was of him. Mr. Brown said, "May I see your draft card?" The card was in a locked box under the table, along with other papers. Larson, the printer, whom Art worked for, had done it. At one time, Larson had been an organizer for a splinter Trotskyist organization, of which Grimmelman had been a member. Studying the card, Mr. Brown said, "You're 26? "Yes," he said. "Born in Warsaw, naturalized in 1932. "You're 4F? Mr. Brown said, returning to the card. "How'd you work that? You look all right to me." "Hernia," Grimmelman said. "And you're positive you don't know this Kendallman?" Actually, there was no Kendallman. He had registered under that name, and he used it now and then in covert political work, undercover work such as spying on fascist student groups, Stalinist fronts, and for taking out library books he did not mean to return. "Positive," he said. He wished Mr. Brown, the FBI man, would leave. He wished it more than anything else on earth. The wish became a passion. In fact, if Mr. Brown did not leave, he would fall dead in his tracks. The sense of danger was too much. He could not bear it. "Quite a place you got here," Mr. Brown said, picking up some photostats of Pravda. "You're interested in politics, Mr. Grimmelman?" Mr. Brown showed no sign of leaving. On the contrary, the more he saw, the more interested he seemed to become. Joe Mantilla said, "He says it's time to get out the Horch. He says we're supposed to go start it up and make sure the engine's tuned." He leaned from the window of his 39 Plymouth toward Art Emanuel, who stood at the curb. Behind the Plymouth, other cars, the traffic along Fillmore, honked and flashed their headlights and swung around. "I'll go get Heike. You can come now, or we'll pick you up on the way back." "Pick me up on the way back," Art said. "Okay, that'll be in around 15 minutes. Mantilla held his watch up to the light from the cars behind. 10:05. Art walked back up the path and down the steps to the apartment. Behind him, the Plymouth, popping and sputtering, gunned off and was gone. The nighttime traffic resumed its regular flow. Closing the front door, he said to Rachel, "We can't go out tonight. I have to do something." She said, "Was that about Grimmelman?" She had put on a coat, and now, in the bathroom, she was combing her hair. They had been about to leave for the bowling alley. She liked to watch the players and be where there was noise and activity and kids her own age, especially on Saturday night. "It looks like we might be doing something," Art said. He was uneasy. He knew how she felt about Grimmelman and the organization. "It's up to you," she said. "But he's so peculiar. I mean, he sits up there all day. He never goes out. Is that what you really want?" "I've got a lot invested in the Horch," he said. It had been his job to supply parts for engine repair. "There's something wrong with him," she said, taking off her coat. "That's what Nat says." "I think you go over there," she said, "because you can't find anything else to do. If you had something else, you'd do it instead." "Maybe you're right," he mumbled, standing first on one foot and then the other. "When will you be back tonight?" "Probably late." He did not really want to go, but he had to. "Will you be okay?" he asked hesitantly. "I might go to a show." "I'd kind of feel better if you stayed home." "Okay," she said. "I will. Could we sometime play poker again?" That was an eternal love of hers. She played a tight game, without talk or motion. Straight or draw poker with no variations and no cards wild. Usually she won $1 or $2. She had frightened off most of Art's high school friends who liked to play goofy, extravagant games with a great deal of horseplay. Once she'd slapped Ferd a Heinke and knocked off his glasses because, in dealing, he had kiddingly turned over a card. "They're all scared to play cards with you," he said. "You take it too seriously." "There's no such thing," she said. "It isn't a game when you play." "Poker isn't a game," she said. "What do you think it is? Do you think it's like hearts or something? That's the trouble with you. You can't tell what's important and what isn't. You're going out to fool around, and you don't know if you're playing a game. It would be playing revolutionary, I guess, Nazi or something, with that car. But you also think you really are a revolutionary, and it isn't a game. So, which are you? You're sort of between. Do you know what this is here? Me, and this apartment, and you? This isn't a game either. And if you go out there and horse around with them, and I don't think you're coming back here, not as soon as you should anyhow, then I'm going to bust you one." She looked at him with that sharp, intent look that was so frightening. Nobody stood up against that. She would demolish the apartment and everything in it. She would lay it waste. And she would not say a word. She would just go about it. And for weeks she would say nothing to him. She would go to work, fix the meals, shop, clean, and sweep the apartment, and never speak to him. The thing about her that was so awe-inspiring was that she never kidded. She never joked. She meant everything she said. It was not boast. It was prophecy. Taking her in his arms, he kissed her. Her face was cold. Her lips, always thin, were dry. He kissed her on the cheek, and he felt the bone close to the surface. He felt the hardness. "You're pretty tough," he said. "I just want you to know." She smiled up at him then. He said, "What else can I do? I have to go." "You don't have to go." "I'm supposed to." He was helpless. "You don't have to do anything. Nobody can make you do anything. All these things they say, it's just a lot of words. Grimmelman is as bad as the rest of them. Grimmelman is like a sign. Do you do what signs say? How about when you read something? Do you do that? Do you believe it because it's up there on the wall or somebody mails it to you in an envelope? You know it's just words. Just talk." He said, "I do some things they tell me." "Don't do anything they tell you." "All of them?" Her hardness troubled him. "Remember all that stuff they taught us in school, all that junk? There never was anything in all of it." With her long, accurate fingers, she looped a thread that dangled from his shirt. She broke the thread and put it into an ashtray on the mantel. He placed his hands on her shoulders. Through the material of her blouse, his hands rested on her, and he felt that she was close to him, close to the surface. "I wish we could go somewhere," she said. "Not just around here. I want to see different places. Maybe someday we could see the Rockies. We could drive up high. We could even live up there. They have towns up there, right in the mountains. It's hard to get a job there, he said. We could open a store, Rachel said. There's always things people want. We could open a bakery. I'm not a baker, he said. Then we could put out a newspaper. He kissed her again, and then he lifted her up, off the floor, and against him. Then he set her down on the arm of the couch. Tell your brother Nat, she said, to give us one of his cars so we can drive. Tell him we need a new one we can sell when we get there. You mean it? He said. Of course she did. But not yet, she said. We better wait until after I have the baby. Then we can go. In a couple of years, when we have some money. When you're finished being an apprentice. You really want to get out of here? After all, he thought, she had been born here. She had grown up here. She said, maybe we could even go up into Canada. I was thinking about that. To one of those towns where they trap animals and there's a lot of snow. You wouldn't like that, he said. But, he thought, maybe she would. The Horch was parked in a sheet metal garage down in the flat industrial section of the city. Grimmelman, in his black wool greatcoat, paratrooper's boots, and army shirt, unlocked the padlock and shoved aside the doors. The garage was clammy. The cement floor was wet with oil. To one side was a workbench. Joe Mantilla put on the overhead light as Art and Rachael closed the doors behind him. Nobody's been here, Ferda said. Nobody's got to it. The Horch was dented from its encounters, but it was still impressive. It weighed almost 6,000 pounds. This car had come up from Latin America. It had been built in 1937 by the Auto Union, and this model, a 5-passenger sport convertible, had been the staff car of the Wehrmacht and SS. Grimmelman had never told anyone how and where he had gotten hold of it, or how much he had paid. The Horch was painted jet black, and with its remote control system, it was unique. Art got in behind the wheel and started up the engine. In the closed garage, the noise deafened them. Exhaust fumes billowed up in clouds, and the smell of gasoline was sickening. It's missing a little, Ferda Heinke said. Lifting the hood, Art began tinkering with the fuel mixture. How come you decided to roll out tonight? He said to Grimmelman. He had never seen Grimmelman so agitated, in such a state of anxiety. The time has arrived, Grimmelman said, pacing in a circle, his hands behind his back. Is that why you're jumping around? Ferda Heinke said, if we're really going to do something tonight, we better get more to go. 4 isn't enough. We ought to get the rest of the organization. The organization faded off indistinctly, without particular edges. Beyond the hardcore were a number of members who came and went. This is more in the nature of a warm-up, Grimmelman said, attaching the relay board of the remote control unit. With a screwdriver, he cinched up the lugs to the terminals. Perspiration streaked his cheeks. His face shone under the light. A dry run, so we'll know we're ready to roll at an instant's notice. Roll where? Joe said. The situation is at a critical stage, Grimmelman said. I want the Horch filled with gas, ready for a long trip. If necessary, we may have to move operations to a new area. As he completed the wiring of the vital control unit, he added, From now on, I want the weapons kept here in the Horch. Where are we going tonight? Ferda Heinke asked. We'll conduct practice maneuvers in the vicinity of Dodos. If possible, we'll engage a Bactrian vehicle. Fine, Joe Mantilla said, hating the Bactrians with their cashmere sweaters and slacks and argyle socks, their country club dances, and especially their late-model Detroit stock cars. See if the coast is clear, Grimmelman said, panting with eagerness. Ferda stepped outside and surveyed the street. I'll take the Plymouth, Joe Mantilla said, passing through the doorway and outside after Ferda. He carried with him the controls and a microphone, and a roll of cable with a jack on the end. Let's see if I can back it out. Seated in the Plymouth, he punched buttons, controlling the Horch. The power-assisted wheel of the Horch revolved as the car shifted gear and began to back. The original 8-speed manual transmission had been removed, and an automatic Borg-Warner transmission installed. The overhead cam engine, with its immense crankshaft supported by 10 bearings, was original equipment. Nothing else was its match. The engine thundered, and the Horch backed from the garage into the street. Its headlights flashed on. It shifted into a forward gear, and the foot throttle eased. From the grill beneath the Auto Union insignia, Joe Mantilla's voice boomed, "Okay, let's go." "Great," Grimmelman said, hurrying outside. Art closed the garage doors. The three of them hurried to the Plymouth to join Joe Mantilla. Joe drove the Plymouth while Grimmelman worked the controls for the Horch. The ponderous Horch started out ahead of them, and they followed closely. It was necessary for them to be near enough to see what lay ahead. In the beginning, their control car had lagged, and the Horch had been permitted to crash against parked cars and curbs. Now they had learned to keep it always in sight. Its headlights swept the pavement, and over its open top they studied the street. "Turn it right," Furtis said. The Horch turned cautiously as Grimmelman slowed it almost to a halt. "More traffic," Grimmelman murmured. His face was tense with the strain of operating the controls. End of Side 2. To continue, change side selector switch and turn the cassette over.